Bienvenue from Montreal, wherever you are and from whatever time zone in which you are participating. Welcome to this Montreal Jewish Public Library special event. My name is John Hobday. I'm the co-chair with Trudis Goldsmith-Raber of the library's English Program Committee. And today's online event is sponsored by the Anita and Ronnie Gabe Jewish Community Foundation, in collaboration with Marc Bissell, the Honorary Consulate General of Austria here in Montreal, as well as the German Consul General, Dr. Susanna Aschi-Glesias. Additional support has been provided by the Montreal Goethe Institute and the Montreal Holocaust Museum. Now, this much anticipated interview with Meriel Schindler has also been made possible through the generous support of the Jewish Book Council. If you have questions, we invite you to put these in the Q&A box. I'll repeat that, questions in the Q&A box, not the chat box, Q&A. Also important to note is that Meriel Schindler's book, The Lost Café Schindler, is available at Librairie Paragraph Bookstore. And the website for that is www.paragraphbooks.com, or by email to paragraph@paragraphbooks.com. So there are two things here, www.paragraphbooks.com, or by email to paragraph@paragraphbooks.com if you wish to order Meriel Schindler's book. Or you can reach them by phone at 514-845-5811, 514-845-5811. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce Marc Bissell, the Honorary Consul General for Austria for the province of Quebec. Marc.
Thank you so much for the introduction, John. On behalf of the Honorary Consul General of Austria, it is really my honor to welcome you to this special event featuring Meriel Schindler, presented by the Jewish Public Library. My sincere appreciation to John and Roxana Brahms for the invitation to be a part of this special event. The consulate has had the privilege to participate with the Jewish Public Library in the past, and we truly value this special relationship and look forward to supporting future events in the future. Of course, it's the usual COVID disclaimer. It would have been wonderful to have been together in person for this event. And I know that our special guest today, Meriel Schindler, was ready to book a plane ticket from London to Montreal to share with us in person. Meriel, we will definitely have to get you to Montreal another time, perhaps for your next book tour. I was in Israel over Passover, and the Lost Schindler Cafe was truly a wonderful companion for me as I read it cover to cover. You know, the Schindler family story is brilliantly told, thanks in part to Meriel's strong, desire to unearth her family history, her incredible research skills, obviously an accomplished lawyer, and the archival treasure trove that was available to her through the archives in Innsbruck, interviews with surviving family members and other sources. Meriel has proven herself to be a credible historian who in her book really brought Austria to life, particularly Innsbruck, life at the Schindler Cafe, and the mountains that surround Innsbruck, which are both at times a source of outdoor leisure and at other times the scene of war and murder. I was personally particularly shaken by Meriel's telling of the events that led to Kristallnacht and her grandfather's vicious beating, and I hope to hear more about this and the process of discovering the story behind these incidents. On a personal note, as a Canadian whose father and grandfather were both born in Vienna, so much of Meriel's story resonated with me. Early in the book, Meriel describes life for Austrian Jews as the pinnacle of assimilated achievement. You know, Jewish Austrians wanted to be Austrians first, as Meriel described in her book. Many, including Meriel's grandparents, grandfather, great uncles fought bravely for Austria in the First World War. Both our families, were faced to a choice. I should say, the idea of assimilation. My grandfather was referred to as Fritz instead of his given name of Isidore. Fritz was a true Austrian name. So the idea of wanting to assimilate, be Austrian first instead of Jewish, was, I think, very, very common at this time, where Austria, Vienna, Innsbruck was just an amazing place to be in a time for Jews where so much of the history that Jews have faced has been very difficult, and certainly difficult times followed. I mean, both of our families were faced with a choice of escape or certain death. And it seems that both of our family members met both of those fates. When I finished Meriel's book last week, the world then observed Yom HaShoah. In telling the Schindler's family story, Meriel brought her family and this time in history, Austrian history, to life. And as a result of this enormous effort, her work serves as an important part of history that will remember the Jews of Austria and the horrendous crimes of the Nazi regime. Yet there are so many untold stories among the 6 million victims. On Yom HaShoah, my children lit a candle, Yurtzai candle, inscribed with the name of a man who was murdered in Auschwitz, and his name was Jakob Berger. So we remember Meriel's family, and we remember Jakob as well, and all the others. Meriel, I'd like, on behalf of the Honorary Consul and personally, I'd like to thank you for keeping the memory of Austrian Jews alive. And I look forward to hearing this conversation. Thank you.
Well, and thank you, Mark, for your very thoughtful personal comments about your own history. Now, a few words about our interviewer, the illustrious Shelley Pomerance. Shelley is the host of Writers Unbound, which is an MATV program about Montreal writers and their books. She's been a programmer with the Blue Metropolis International Literary Festival, and for many years was a vibrant presence on CBC Radio, both as a host and as an arts reporter. So Shelley, over to you.
Thank you so much, John. And thanks also to Roxana Browns for inviting me to conduct this interview with Meriel Schindler. If you search around online, you'll find only a very succinct bio for Meriel Schindler, just a couple of lines that read like this. Meriel Schindler spent the first 15 years of her life growing up in central London before suddenly being moved to a convent school in provincial Austria. 5 years later, she moved back to the UK to study French and German at university and is now an employment lawyer, partner, and head of a team at Withers LLP, a law firm in London in the UK. That's a very short and rather modest bio. In fact, Meriel Schindler has a fascinating and complex family history. It's been rumored that she's related to some very famous people, such as Franz Kafka, Alma Schindler, who was married to Gustav Mahler, Walter Gropius, and Franz Werfel, though not all at the same time. Also Oskar Schindler and Adele Bloch-Bauer, the woman in gold in Gustav Klimt's celebrated painting. Not to mention Eduard Bloch, who was Hitler's physician, also the physician of Clara Hitler, his mother. We'll find out in just a few minutes about these family connections, real or imagined. But aside from these famous individuals, her family history is a very compelling one in so many other ways. Her father, Kurt Schindler, died in 2017, and that's what suddenly spurred her to explore her family history and tell the story of the Lost Café Schindler. Welcome, Meriel Schindler.
Thank you very much, Shelley, for that very gracious and lovely introduction. And thank you also, John and Mark, for your very, very kind words. Yes, Mark talked about putting, I suppose, Austrian Jews back on the map, and I suppose to some extent this book does this. But it does something else, which is it looks at the Jews of Western Austria and not of Vienna. And that was rather a different ball game for those Jews, not least because there were very, very few of them in Western Austria, but they nevertheless suffered pretty much the same fate as the Jews elsewhere. So yes, it's not an area that has been written about very much, I think. But yes.
Can we start with your father? Can you give us a kind of thumbnail sketch of your father? He seems like he was a rather challenging individual.
Yes. Sometimes when I talk to people as part of these sessions, I feel I ought to be on a psychiatrist's couch, you know, sort of horizontal, because they ask me about my father. And it's fair to say that I had a tricky relationship with him. It was a difficult relationship. As a small child, I adored him. But as I grew up, I realized that he had a very difficult relationship with reality, with truth, with honesty, and that I found very troubling as I was growing up. And in terms of what he looked like, that's also perhaps a good place to start. I'm just going to share my screen because we can see him then in his youth. Just that should come up right now. So there he is. I think if you can see that now. On the left-hand side, that's my father. He's about 24 there, and my grandmother Edith, and my grandfather on the far right is Hugo. So that's a sort of interesting family shot. Now this is just after the war. They have returned. Some of the very, very few Jews who returned to Austria, let alone to Innsbruck, very, very few returned to Innsbruck. There were very few in the first place, as I said. And they are celebrating an anniversary of the cafe, the eponymous Café Schindler, and they are sitting there with their staff around them in the glory of the cafe that they have just received essentially back after the war.
Those were really his glory days, but there were some very difficult times that followed.
So he was my father. So here he is as a young man. He's handsome. He's dashing. He is very, very charming, very persuasive, my father. But as I said, he has a difficult relationship with truth, and that relationship of not always being able to tell the truth, and of boasting sometimes about relations that really were not relations. You mentioned a few in your introduction, Shelley, was very much part of his character. So he would boast about the fact that we were related to Oskar Schindler. People always ask me this. As far as I can tell, we are not related to Oskar Schindler. And for those who know the story of Schindler's List or Schindler's Ark, the Thomas Keneally book in its original version, Oskar Schindler was a card-carrying Nazi. He wasn't Jewish. So, and my family was Jewish. So, you know, the idea that we are related is really nonsense. Other people he used to boast about, he used to say we were related to Bruno Kreisky, the first president after the Second World War of Austria. Alma Mahler, again not Jewish. She liked Jewish men, but she was a virulent anti-Semite. Franz Kafka, yes, but very, very distantly we are related to him. And as you say, Adele Bloch-Bauer, again, very, very distantly via marriage. So we did have some illustrious relations, but he basically extended that category way beyond where it ought to have been extended. Yes, he told lots of anecdotes, basically.
You had a great uncle, Edward Bloch, who I mentioned earlier, who was the Hitler family's personal physician. He was a relative of yours.
Yes, and that was one of the anecdotes when I was growing up that I simply didn't believe. It just seemed too incredible that my father's uncle would be a general practitioner, a doctor in Upper Austria, and in 1907, a young woman walks into his surgery. I'm going to show you a picture of her, and she is. Let's work out how to do that. How do I get to the next slide on my screen? Sorry. I'll talk about it in a minute. So she walks into his surgery. She's in her middle years. The doctor is an incredibly kind doctor. He is very much someone who is prepared to treat people regardless of their means, and he takes her name, and her name is Clara Hitler, and she's complaining of terrible breast pains. He is a skilled doctor, and he pretty much knows what is up. And he then decides that he takes her name, Clara Hitler, that she has to have an operation, but he doesn't want to tell her at that point, and he tells her to bring her family with her to the next consultation. And the next consultation, she comes a couple of days later, and she arrives with her children in tow, including the 17-year-old Adolf Hitler, who is distraught at the idea that his mother is ill, and is very much someone who is crying in the consultation room, and the doctor describes him as a young man who loves his mother. Now, this is obviously a side of Hitler that we don't normally see. I'm no Hitler apologist, but they formed a bond, these two. The doctor was there during the operation. She had a double mastectomy, and he treated Clara Hitler throughout her convalescence. She made a little bit of a recovery, however, did then subsequently die. And Adolf Hitler was very, very grateful to the good doctor. And he, when he went to Vienna, as we know, he appeared at he went to the Art Academy and didn't get in. But from there, as he drifted through the sort of lower echelons of Viennese society, he sent postcards, some of them hand painted by him, to the doctor to express his eternal gratitude. And his gratitude was indeed eternal. Roll on to 1938. Hitler arrives in his favorite town, Linz, and at that point he doesn't meet him formally, but he looks up at the doctor's window and salutes him as on the way into town. And the Dr. Bloch's family is not touched during all the horrors that happen in Linz. They are protected, and they eventually all emigrate. And now the descendants are now living in North America.
You have a photo of Clara Hitler there. Do you want to try and show it?
There we go. So I just need my second screen is obscuring my ability to do the slides, so I can see what I'm doing now. So you should be able to see the picture of Clara Hitler. So this is on her wedding day. This is the young Clara Hitler, and you can see she has very beautiful eyes that the doctor comments on.
You actually knew very little about your relatives until after your father died. What suddenly moved you to learn more about them? Why only after he died?
I think my father died destitute. His life was one long financial crisis, and so we didn't inherit any assets. Not that I necessarily believe in inheriting assets, but what I did inherit were 13 quite extraordinary photo albums, and like so many photo albums of that era, no one had written underneath the pictures who the pictures were of.
Actually, maybe you'll take the picture of Clara Hitler down now. So
I will take Clara down, and
now
I'll
that
show
we're talking
you.
about your
So
family.
this is my family, and this in fact was not a picture I had in my albums that I inherited, but one I got from getting back in contact with relatives. So this was given to me by a very nice gentleman called Tom Salzer in America, who's a relative, and it's an extraordinary. This is just before the First World War. They've all gathered there in their finery, in their long dresses, pre-First World War, obviously, and my great-grandmother and my great-grandfather, Sophie and Samuel Schindler, the sort of patriarch and matriarch of the family, are on the left-hand side, and then you have Martha, Otto, my grandfather in his younger years, Hugo, and then you have Erwin and Eric. So a sort of very, they're wealthy, they run a distillery in Innsbruck, they make jams, and they are assimilated. They're very, to be fair to Innsbruck, at the time, Innsbruck doesn't even have a synagogue. It has a prayer room, and as far as
how big was the Jewish community there?
500 people.
Oh, okay.
I mean, it was tiny, 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 tiny. And they're running a business. So as far as I can tell, they weren't particularly observant. And in fact, from the little snippets I can pick up from diaries of the time, they didn't even keep kosher. So they were totally assimilated.
And you only became interested in this family after your father was gone.
Yes, there was something about photos. I'll show you some other photos, which is as we move on towards the First World War. So there was something about this photo that was particularly striking for me. This was in one of the albums. So this is really different to the very staged studio shot you've just seen, because you can see here are the young boys are just off to war. Now, this is an incredibly pivotal moment for young Jewish men. So they're off to serve their Kaiser Franz Josef in the First World War in 1914. This is the summer of 1914. And for a young Jewish man, putting on the uniform of their Kaiser was the moment when they felt complete acceptance. They were going to be allowed to serve their Kaiser in this war that was engulfing Austria. And they set off in very much the same way that the British boys set off in the summer of 1914. Both sides believe they will be home by Christmas. Of course, 4 bloody and horrible years later, many of them did not return, including my uncle, who's the one in the middle there. He died on the Eastern Front. And for them, I think this photo is particularly interesting because you can see my great-grandmother, Sophie, you can see the anxiety on her face. She is sending 4 boys into war, and she must be calculating her odds there. She's not in her finery there. She looks really quite distressed at that point. And so 3 of her 4 boys do return. This is rather a lovely picture. This is again my grandfather Hugo is on the left-hand side there, and they're doing some kind of reconnaissance. And again, this photo I found fascinating. It's a photo my father always had by his bedside. It's a sort of long ways photo. This is a section of it. It's got a whole mountainscape, and there's a number of things that are fascinating about it, because when you look at the middle chap, he's holding a bottle. And my grandfather's and my great-grandfather's business was, of course, a distillery. I have tried with, sort of lenses to blow the bottle up to see if it's a Schindler liqueur. But there's something about this. It's almost like a posed advertising shot, because here he is up in the mountains in uniform, and this chap behind him with the monocle is holding a schnapps bottle. And it's like I think it's something like a postcard home, or even a sort of advertisement for their wares during the war. I can't swear that it's actually a Schindler bottle, but it just seems so coincidental that they're there. And then I've always said my grandfather was an incredibly good looking man, and this is him. He was a decorated officer in the First World War, and you can see. I mean, he reminds me of those pictures of the sort of movie stars of the silver screen at that time. The sort of Errol Flynn's. He's got his hair slicked back. He's a very, and he knows he's good looking.
He knows it. You can tell
He
from that.
absolutely knows he's good looking. That smile around the lips, and he's proud. Look at the way he's showing his medal off. So that's him. And I said 3 of the boys return from the First World War, and they return to an Austria. For those who know the story of Austria after the First World War, so Germany was subjected to the Treaty of Versailles, and a similar treaty was applied to Austria, which was the Saint-Germain-en-Laye Treaty. And that treaty, as I think we now understand, was obviously very ill-advised, because what it did was it dismembered the empire. So the Austro-Hungarian Empire fell apart, and basically those countries who had fought for the Allies basically had war spoils. The land was parceled up. But what was particularly relevant for the Tyrol, for Western Austria, where my family lived, was the fact that the South Tyrol, the area just over what is the Brenner Pass, was taken away. So the North Tyrol was severed from the South Tyrol, and that had cataclysmic consequences for the North Tyrol and for the people who lived there.
You
So
should say that your family, the men in your family certainly had this very strong feeling of being Tyrolean, not just Austrian.
No, they were people of the mountains. They were, my grandfather was born, Hugo was born in the Tyrol. He loved the mountains, and these photo albums I had endless. He loved photography. Endless photos of him striding up mountains, across glaciers, lying spread-eagled in the snow, in the sunshine, with his top off. I mean, he really loved walking, and he was a member of the Alpenverein, which was the main mountain walking sort of group club, if you like, one that became obviously very anti-Jewish later.
Can you explain where the cafe fits in here? The cafe was opened in...
Yes, in 1922. So my grandfather, who you can just still see up on the screen, so he returns from the First World War to an Innsbruck that is destitute. So the removal of the South Tyrol meant that everything that, in a sense, everything that made life worth living, the soft fruits, the grapes, the wine, the olive oil, all of the stuff that flowed over the Brenner Pass into the North Tyrol from the South Tyrol, from what is now northern Italy, was now no longer flowing. And so that, not only did that make life difficult, but it also made obtaining the soft fruits to create the liqueurs difficult. So this was a really difficult business time, and Austria was essentially bankrupt. There were children, there are descriptions of children roaming the streets in Vienna who were starving. And when I look at the black and white photos of Innsbruck, there's some extraordinary photos of the women queuing up for milk, and you can see their hollowed out cheeks. You can see how destitute they are. And what does my grandfather do at that point? He decides he's going to not just continue the distillery business his father had founded, but he's going to open a cafe. And not just any old cafe. It's going to be the grandest and best cafe in town. And this is a shot, this is slightly later, this is early 1930s, I think, late 20s, early 30s. And he opens this extraordinary cafe, triple fronted, on the main street in Innsbruck. And it's a very nice shot, this, because you can see the mountains, the northern chain of mountains, which are very visible all the way through Innsbruck. And it's a cafe where you have dancing, you have 2 ballrooms by the time it gets in due course, you play bridge there, you play cards there, but above all, you go and you eat cake there and you drink fabulous coffee. And if you can launch a business in the teeth of the worst economic depression Austria's ever suffered, then it's going to survive.
And there was dancing there till all hours of the night as well, and jazz, right? This is in the 20s.
I'm going to show you one of my grandfather turned away from the sort of empire, and he looked forward. And this is a graphic that he commissioned. And one of the things I love about this, it's very modern, it's strikingly modern. So you compare, the woman has short bobbed hair. Obviously all the women in the photos you've seen up until now have long hair. It's all braided and around their heads. This woman's got bobbed hair. And on the left-hand side, you can see a jazz band. And my grandfather loved music and he loved jazz. And I think that's one of the particular hallmarks of the cafe, is they played a lot of jazz there.
Can you tell us a bit about the Sachertorte Wars?
I will. I'll keep this photo up because it sets the background.
Yes.
So Sachertorte was it was a fascinating story. So as you probably know, Sachertorte is this very rich chocolate cake. It's one of Vienna's main exports, and it was invented by a young pastry chef called Franz Sacher in 1832, allegedly. He was the pastry chef for Prince Metternich, who was the foremost diplomat of the day. And I think the other chefs were out or ill or something. Anyway, Metternich said, make me a dessert, make me a pudding that my guests will be proud of. And this young 16-year-old invented this chocolate cake, which classically is 2 layers of chocolate cake, chocolate sponge, with an apricot jam in the middle, and then a mirror glaze over the top, mirror chocolate glaze over the top. And his son was a chap called Edward Sacher, and he perfected it, and he moved from, he was no longer obviously employed by Metternich because he was the son. He went and worked for a very, very well-known cafe, which I think has been closed for a long time. I don't know whether it's now reopened, but it was closed throughout the pandemic, called the Café Demel, very famous Viennese cafe. And he went and worked there and perfected the Sachertorte. And then he moved on and founded the Hotel Sacher after his name. So this chocolate cake had sort of moved through various institutions. And when it got to the 20th century, both institutions, the cafe and the hotel, claimed that they had made the original Sachertorte, which was sort of true because they had at different times worked on it. And they sued each other because they didn't want the other one to say that they had the original recipe. And these sort of cake wars continued for many years, and they had expert witnesses who had to then attest to the type of the cake and how much chocolate was in it and la la la. Anyway, this went on, and eventually they settled, and they settled in a way that said essentially both sides could say that they were original. One has a triangular little chocolate thing on it, and one has a round one. So they've basically made their peace with each other, and both sell the original Sachertorte.
But this went on for decades and decades.
It went for decades, yeah. It's a very Viennese sort of concern, really. And I think other people would have moved on eventually, but they didn't in Vienna.
Including the Sachertorte wars, you did tons of research, I guess over a period of 3 years for this book. I mean, it's a thick book here.
Yeah.
You met relatives you'd never met before in the States. You went to all these museums. You walked the trails that your grandfather would have walked during the First World War. You visited a coffee roaster in Innsbruck. You took a pole dancing class. Tell us about the pole dancing.
It became hardly obsessional, I think. I think what happened was, I think like a lot of young kids growing up, my father had told all these anecdotes, and I had basically stuck my fingers in my ears and not listened. And then I was faced with these photo albums where I didn't know the people in the photo albums, and I wanted to find out who they were. And I also had these anecdotes from my father, and I wanted to sort of understand whether any of them were true.
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose the one I told about Hitler and Dr. Bloch, to my astonishment, turned out to be true because I'd always discounted it. Moving on to sort of 1938, one of the anecdotes my father told, which I absolutely believed, was that he was there on what we now call the November pogrom on Kristallnacht, when my grandfather Hugo was beaten up. That turned out not to be true. So there's a sort of...
Your grandfather was beaten up, but your father wasn't there.
Yeah, correct.
Tell us. We'll get back to Kristallnacht, but I want to hear about the pole dancing.
Oh, the pole dancing. Well, for those of you who Google ORF, you will actually see me reenacting the pole dancing. So what happened was, the flat that my great grandparents had originally lived in is still there, except that it is now turned into a premier pole dancing studio.
In Innsbruck.
Yeah, this is in Innsbruck, and I suppose it's half a pole dancing studio and half a law office. And I found myself wandering up the stairs, and the door, I was thinking I'd knock on the office of the lawyers and say I was a lawyer and could I look around, because I wanted to be in the flat that my grandparents had lived in as part of just understanding their milieu. And rather than knocking on this very solid wooden door of the lawyers, I found myself walking through the open door to the pole dance studio. And sort of before I knew what I was letting myself in for, I'd signed up to a beginner's class in pole dancing. Now, I have to say,
I think you take your research very far.
I was atrocious at pole dancing. I'm not totally unfit. I go running, I like weights, I like yoga, but I was really bad at pole dancing. There was something about the amount of core strength required to go up and down these poles that I just didn't possess.
What was
Anyway,
it like to be in their apartment though?
it was really interesting because in some ways it's just an empty room with these metal poles in it and a wooden floor. But when you close your eyes and think about it, well, now I closed my eyes and thought about it, I could sort of conjure them up a little bit, because they lived there with all 5 kids. So I could imagine all the kids running around and the shop downstairs. So it helped me just imagine what their family life was like. That's why I did it.
There's one more bit of research that you did that I'd love for you to talk about. You discovered a Torah scroll that had most likely been used by your great-great-great-grandfather in Europe, and you discovered it just down the street from your home in London.
Yes, so my great grandmother's family came from Bohemia, and they were the distillers. So my great grandfather Samuel learned distillery skills from her family, and they came from sort of southern Bohemia, so the area just south of Prague now, and they sort of moved around in that area. So they had set up distilleries and also what they called Brandweinhäuser, so basically pubs and guest houses, and sort of they made the schnapps and liqueurs and they sold them. Basically, that's the story. And one of the places that they were from was Hradovich, which again is this tiny little place. And there were a lot of Jews in Bohemia, and it was a very vibrant Jewish community. And there was a synagogue there, which had a couple of Torah scrolls. And one of the things that happened, so in the sort of mid-1940s, or early 40s, what happened was when the Nazi official in Prague was sort of thinking about how he was going to deal with the Jews of Czechoslovakia, what he decided to do was essentially order them to send all of their items of worship to Prague, and he had them catalogued, and extraordinarily the Jews handed over all of their scrolls and religious items, the combs and the knives and the candlesticks, and so these items arrived in crates in Prague and were catalogued by Jews in Prague, who obviously then ended up in camps themselves. And whilst it's not entirely clear why he did this, it is thought he was going to create a museum of the extinct race, because of course the Jews were going to be extinct by the time the Nazis had finished. So it's a very incredibly chilling and upsetting thought, this. But anyway, the Torah scrolls in Hradovich ended up in Prague with 1,500 other such scrolls. The Nazis obviously only lasted, thank God, 7 years. They did enough damage in that time. And the scrolls were then basically stored in a synagogue just outside Prague for a couple of years. And at that point, in post-war, Cold War Prague, they needed money. And so they offered these old scrolls from these largely dead Jews for sale. They hawked them around a bit, and eventually the Westminster Synagogue, which is essentially just down the road from where I live in London, essentially bought all the scrolls. So a great big truck full of these Torah scrolls arrived in 1960 something in London. And then they had an incredible scribe basically repair those scrolls that could be repaired, and the rest that were too damaged, rather than burying them, which is what normally happens to a scroll if it can't be used any longer, rather than burying them, they are in a display cabinet at a small museum in this synagogue. So, and they having repaired the scrolls, the Westminster Synagogue formed a charity, a foundation, that then sent the scrolls out to be used by other communities all around the world. So this is an incredibly emotional story where these scrolls were stolen, just partially destroyed, repaired, and then sent out to these extraordinary communities all over the world. But one of the ones they retained in the actual synagogue in Westminster is one of the ones from Haradovich. So when I occasionally go there, and I have this extraordinary sense when the Ark is open that the scroll that is being used there is one that was actually used by my family, which is, I find, quite extraordinary.
Must be
Yeah.
very moving. Let's go back to Innsbruck. After World War I, as you mentioned, the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapses. Innsbruck has this small Jewish community of about 500 people, and there is growing anti-Semitism in the town. How does this affect the Schindlers? What happens to them?
So, I mean, this is in many ways, a well-known story, but I think it has particular poignancy in Innsbruck. Innsbruck is a small town. Everyone knows everyone, and everyone knows the Schindlers. The Schindlers not only have this distillery and the jam factory, but they also have this extraordinary cafe in this very prominent position. So I'm going to go back to screen sharing so that you can see that. Can you see that?
We can see, yes, the poster from the cafe.
That's right. So let me so we go back to the cafe. That's an early shot of the cafe. But as we move on into the 1930s, this is the main street outside the cafe, the one that you've just seen in the cafe shot. So this is the main street, and it's what you have is a population, as I've described, who were incredibly poor, who were starving after the First World War, and who are now being promised redemption. They're being promised jobs and motorways. Hello.
Slideshow mode, isn't it?
Sorry,
Slideshow or PowerPoint.
I can't interrupt me. Right?
Yeah, sorry. It's just it shows better if you.
Yeah, I don't know how to do it. Yeah, okay.
Slideshow.
Okay. Sorry, I'm just getting some tips from my husband who's trying to help. I may have clicked on the wrong mode, but anyway, it's not the end of the world, I think. So what I was just describing was that the main street outside the cafe was full of people who were showing their adoration for the Nazis who were about to arrive in Innsbruck. And so what was happening was that, let me see if I can switch it to slideshow mode. Hang on. Display settings. I'll switch it to one. No, not that one. That one. That one's better, isn't it? Is that better?
Yes.
So what this is a very good. This is a very much a local picture. Again, this is very much the Tyrol. You have a strong chap who's wearing lederhosen, very Tyrolean thing to wear. And what you have here is the starving, poor Austrians on the left-hand side of this bridge, and the German on the right-hand side with a German flag. And you can see there in the writing the word Anschluss. So when the Austrians very much wanted to join together with Germany, they felt having had the South Tyrol taken away from them, they didn't feel they could feed themselves, and they wanted to join with Greater Germany. And this is a very good illustration. It's a propaganda poster, but it's a very good illustration of how they felt at the time.
Meriel, can you possibly speak a little bit louder?
Sure, I can. Sorry, I was having a bit of a frog in my throat. So,
being a lawyer, I figured you could.
Yes, I can speak loudly. So that's where what happened with the Anschluss, and the sort of, I think you get a real sense from this of the desire of the population to link up with Germany. So should I stop screen sharing?
No, you have we gone as far as 10, 11, 12, 13?
What do you want next?
I don't know. We were looking at
Okay,
how this affected the Schindlers. I don't know whether there's more photos we want to see.
Yeah.
And maybe you could tell us what happened on Kristallnacht, which you've referred to, but
yeah. So Kristallnacht I will talk about just shortly, but I think this is a photo of, again, you can see the main street. You can still see the Café Schindler. It hasn't yet had its name changed. It is taken away by the Nazis. But this is the classic shot of Innsbruck. And you have some bright spark who, as very much as a sort of sales, as a sales technique for this postcard, has basically stuck a swastika above the mountains. So
it is an incredible photograph.
It's an extraordinary photo, really, isn't it? And this is what is happening outside the cafe. So again, this is the same shot of the same street. The cafe is just out of shot on the right-hand side. This is a senior Nazi arriving in Innsbruck to cheering, Heil Hitlering crowds. And he is greeting the cafe opposite, which was a hotbed of Nazis at the time. So there you have what's happening on the street outside the cafe. You roll on, you asked about Kristallnacht, about November 1938. And I think, I mean, when I look at the records of what happened in Innsbruck, in this very small town with this very small number of Jews, it was one of the bloodiest pogroms throughout the entire German Reich, because they set out to kill people. In principle, the whole idea of this uprising was to scare the Jews into leaving, to destroy property, smash up shops, and scare them into leaving the country. In Innsbruck, however, despite the incredibly low number of Jews, they also set out to kill. So there were 2 Jews who were killed that night, and my grandfather, Hugo, was not killed, thankfully. He was beaten up and left for dead. And the Nazis the thugs who were sent out to do that were told, beat him up, don't worry about it, there will be no police on the streets, which there weren't, and it doesn't matter if you leave him for dead. And that's what they were told as they set out that night to beat him up.
So he did get beaten up, but in his own home, right? Not on the street.
Where I did the pole dancing.
Wow, it's quite a story. And in the meantime, what's happening with the cafe when there's all this anti-Semitism? You have a photograph, I think, of that too, don't you, of the cafe?
The cafe is taken away from my grandparents, and it is basically taken over by a Nazi called Franz Hebel, and he's trained in hospitality, at least, so he's not going to let it go under. And it reinvents itself, essentially, the cafe, from this incredible place where you fell in love and you danced and you listened to jazz. It reinvents itself as a Nazi officers' drinking club, basically.
Did you have a photograph of the cafe with all this anti-Semitic graffiti on it? There it is.
It's just still my grandfather's cafe. It's still got Schindler over the door. But this is March 1938, and this is just before it's taken away from him, essentially, and he's no longer allowed to run the cafe. So that's what happens to it.
So your family lost everything basically in Innsbruck,
Yeah.
the cafe, the factory. They had a villa where they lived after they lived in the apartment.
Yeah.
And the cafe was taken over by Hebel.
By Franz Hebel, correct.
Right. I think you have a picture that goes with that too, of the cups from the cafe.
Right. So that's again some graffiti that was just these are the mountains that you've seen in the other shots just above, and the classic sort of slogan: one people, one empire, one leader. Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer. And this was basically in 10-foot high sort of letters on the mountain so that it could be seen from the town.
Incredible.
So the chap who takes over Innsbruck is a chap called Franz Hofer, the slightly portly chap here on the right. And he is very good friends with Herr Hitler, who arrives in Innsbruck and is seen. He comes to Innsbruck a couple of times during the war and is always wined and dined by Hofer. Hofer is the Gauleiter. There are only 42 Gauleiters, and they report directly to Hitler, and they look after the various provinces that the German Empire has been divided up into. Shall I move on?
Yes. We were done there. That's what I wanted to see.
I think you wanted this one.
Yeah.
So the Café Schindler gets rebranded, and this Nazi, Franz Hebel, takes over. And what is so fascinating about these two cups, I still have these two cups, is we drank hot chocolate out of them as children. So they were very much part of our childhood. And for some reason, I never really understood why some of the cups had Hebel, and I'm not sure I really took it in. Only now do I know who Franz Hebel was. He was the Nazi who took over the cafe. So we had these Nazi cups knocking around in our kitchen cupboard alongside our own sort of ceramic fragments, if you like, from the cafe. And what I think is so interesting about this is that our branding was obviously spot on. The Schindler branding was great. So much so that the Nazi who took over the cafe didn't bother to change the branding at all. He just slapped his own name on it and carried on merrily with our branding. And that's because the cafe was incredibly central. It was important to morale, and Hebel himself gets done for black marketeering towards the end of the war. And he's, he would have been, it's a capital offence. He could have been put before a firing squad. But essentially what happens is he gets let off with a very minimal punishment and is sent back to run the cafe. Why? Because the cafe is seen by the Nazis as important to morale. All the officers who passed through Innsbruck, all the convalescing soldiers, everyone who was anyone went to the cafe, whether it was run by Nazis or whether it was run by my family.
But by this time, your family has basically left Austria, right?
Yes. Yes.
Your own family ended up in England mostly,
Yes.
and other relatives in the States, correct?
We got scattered. I mean, it's a very familiar Jewish family, Jewish Central European tale. We ended up in England, and the rest of them went essentially to North America.
And in your book, you say that people left with hardly any money. They were allowed to take. I mean, this was a family that was a very comfortable family. Had to leave everything behind, and they got to take 10 Reichsmarks, you say? It's almost nothing.
I mean, that was the maximum you were allowed to take out. I mean, very clearly what was going on was they were forced to list out all their assets. The assets were then taken away from them, and they had to pay various taxes. There was something called a Reichsfluchtsteuer, which was a fleeing from the Reich tax, basically, which I think was 25% of your worldly goods, and everything else was impounded and in frozen accounts. So even when the assets were, the Germans were very particular about the fact that assets had to be sold to to Nazis. They didn't just take them, they did go through process.
Yeah.
But the money that you got for the cafe or for the villa or for the liqueur factory, it all went into a frozen account. So you never actually benefited from it. Even it was always sold at an undervalue, and the money went into a frozen account. But my family did get out. They thought that they were going to come to England, and they thought that they would maybe start another cafe here. And one of the most moving photo albums of the 13 I inherited has basically extraordinary photos of the cafe, and my grandfather's written in English and in German under each photo what it is. It's one of the only ones where there's writing in the album, because he was clearly, these were his credentials. This was his photographic CV, if you like, because he wanted to start another cafe in England.
You never actually knew these grandparents that you write about.
No.
You never met.
He died in 1952, so he died before I was born.
The Schindler Cafe, it reopened in 2018.
Yes.
And you have been there.
So what happened was, the cafe, after the war, my family returned to Innsbruck, and they got the cafe back, and my grandfather returned and he reopened it. It had been bomb damaged, he repaired it, and he reopened the cafe almost as a sort of another gift to this town that had basically spurned him and beaten him up. But he loved Innsbruck, he loved the mountains, and he loved the Tyrol. And that I don't think that love ever faded.
And this was when he did this?
So 1946, he was back in Innsbruck and he reopened the cafe. So by 47, it was basically reopened. He got it back and it was reopened. And sadly, he died in 1952, at which point my father inherited with his cousin. And my father, being my father, managed to fall out with everyone. He was a terrible businessman. And the cafe sort of stumbled on for a little bit further and then was sold. And by the sort of mid-70s, the name had disappeared completely. And certainly when I lived in Innsbruck from 1979 through to 1984, there was no Café Schindler. But the concept of the cafe, the memory of the cafe lived on in people's hearts. So when I said my name I went to school there, so when I said my name to the parents of my friends, they would go, "Oh, the Café Schindler, I used to dance all night there," or "I met my first boyfriend there." And everyone remembered the cafe. And so when you roll forward then to, I think it was actually 2012, a young restaurateur who knew nothing about our family arrives in Innsbruck from Salzburg, and he wants to open a restaurant, a really nice upmarket restaurant. And the building he picked happened to be the exact one that my grandfather had chosen. And he goes to the planning office, he goes to the licensing office, he talks to his local girlfriend's family, and they all go, "My friend, no question, no doubt, it's got to be called Café Schindler." He's like, "Who are these people? I don't know them." And he goes to the archives, he types in my name, and then he realizes these photos come back of the cafe. He's got a 100-year history nearly ready-made. And you can't buy that kind of heritage. You can't buy that kind of love for an institution. So he opens his cafe and he is fully booked from day one. And given he's not got the whole building, he's only on the first floor now. And I'll show you a photo of that in a minute. He's on the first floor, which is quite difficult. So to convince people to come out of the street and onto the first floor is quite tricky. He's been basically fully booked since he opened 10 years ago. And of course, he's delighted. He's delighted at the fact I've now written a book about the cafe, because it's created all this publicity around it. And I was in Innsbruck 2 weeks ago, launching the German edition of the book. And I mean, we had strudel from the cafe and we went and celebrated in the cafe, and he was completely overwhelmed with joy the sort of commercial enterprise I had created for him by writing a book.
So there is a German edition and people have read it.
Yes, and literally the German edition has just come out. Came out at the end of March, and
so you had reaction from it already?
Yes. I mean, I thought a few people would come to the launch in Innsbruck. 200 people came. Wow. I was astonished. And we didn't have enough room for them in the room, let alone enough strudel for them. I mean, we just hadn't catered for that many people, but people came and they were incredibly gracious and kind. And it was a really nice homecoming, really.
I think I'm just going to ask you one more question before we go take questions from our viewers and listeners. Are you inspired to write another book?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I've got some ideas. I mean, the more you delve around in my family, the more you work out that there's some very eccentric people in it. And so, yes, I have a maternal grandmother, not Jewish, on the non-Jewish side of my family, who appears to have had an affair with a spy and a lot of illegitimate children. And I'm kind of thinking about researching that at the moment.
Okay. Somebody asked here, did you feel your grandfather's presence when you were pole dancing in his flat? Somebody writes, I'm pretty sure he would have been watching.
Funnily enough, it was my great grandmother I was imagining, because I was imagining her in her long dress with these 5 kids around her. Because I think my great grandfather, would have been downstairs because they had a shop there. And so I imagined her with these 5 kids and her just sort of looking utterly perplexed about what was going on in her sitting room. So,
how helpful do you think it was being a lawyer in researching this? Because some of the research was very, very detailed that you did.
I think the thing about being a lawyer is you're not frightened of a pile of documents. So I'd go to the archives and I'd say, can I have everything you've got on X, Y, or Z? And sometimes they'd come with extraordinary piles of documents. And I wasn't put off by that. And I read fluent German. I think that helps. So I think it helped not being worried by being faced by lots of documents. And it made me systematic. And I also wanted to understand the truth. I wanted to honour those in my family who didn't get out. We haven't talked about those yet, but I had
we have a question right here. Somebody asked if you could talk about the relatives who did not escape.
So I might screen share for the last bit as well, which I'll talk about them first. So you saw my great grandmother had one daughter, Martha, who was the woman standing next to her in one of those early photos. And she lived in Vienna with her husband, and she didn't get out, nor did her husband, nor did my great grandmother, Sophie. And what happened was Franz Hofer, the Gauleiter who we saw next to Hitler, there was sort of a competition going on amongst the Gauleiters as to who would make their Gau, their province, Jew-free quickest. I mean, it's horrible, but anyway, he swept his Jews, the few Jews that there were in the Tyrol and Vorarlberg, he swept them all to Vienna. And so my great-grandmother Sophie, as an 84-year-old, ended up living with her daughter Martha in Vienna. And everyone else had left. And I think there wasn't much point in staying if you had your visa, because all the visas were individually granted at different times. So you had to leave when your visa came up. And a lot of effort was made to try and get them out, both from Martha's children who were there by then in the US, and also by my grandfather. And there's some very traumatic correspondence where they're writing to them, and you can hear the efforts that they're trying to make to get them out. They don't get them out, and they are swept. They are then forced to move from Vienna from their nice flat in Vienna, first of all, to what was called a Sammelwohnung, a collection flat, so one of these shared flats, which was basically a sort of penning opportunity. And from there, they were moved to Theresienstadt. And Theresienstadt was in Bohemia, where my great-grandmother had originally come from. And my great-grandmother died within days of arriving. It was grossly overcrowded, Theresienstadt. Siegfried Salzer, Martha's husband, died very quickly as well. But Martha herself was made of sterner stuff, and She survived right the way through to 1942, and she was then put on a train to Auschwitz, and there the trail goes cold. We know she got to Auschwitz because she was seen there, but then she was presumably gassed.
But you've been working very hard to commemorate these relatives of yours who died.
Yeah. And what I did, so those I don't know how many of the audience have been to Vienna. Vienna's been extraordinary about commemorating the Austrian Jews who died. So 65,000 Austrian Jews died in the Holocaust. They have just, I haven't visited yet, but they have just put up a wall where all the names are engraved on the wall. So that's just opened in the last year, basically. But the other thing that anyone who's been to Vienna in the last 5-10 years will know is that you see these metal plates like the size of a cobblestone set in the pavement, and they have the birth and death dates and the name of the person who died. And the idea is that they're called, elsewhere in the world, they're called Steine der Erinnerung, stones of remembrance. So they're called stones. Sorry, they're called stones of remembrance in Vienna. Elsewhere, they're called Stolpersteine, which is stumbling stones, but for reasons that are too complicated to explain. But the Viennese have done these stones, and they're very moving because sometimes they're put there by the people who live in the block of flats or house, who've done some research and realised it once belonged to a Jewish family who lived there. Sometimes it's the relatives who put them there. And I put some there. I will share the screen again. Let's move on from there. That's me doing some research with my son. I dragged them up lots of mountains. That's Martha, who I talked about as my great aunt, who died in Auschwitz. And somehow I also think she looks slightly like me. So I have a very strong connection with this woman I never met. And my last photo is these Steine der Erinnerung, the metal plates that I have had installed outside Martha's flat in Vienna. So this commemorates Martha Salzer, my great aunt, her husband Siegfried Salzer, and Sophie, my great grandmother. And they don't mince their words on these stones. They say the date, and that she was deported to Theresienstadt, and she was murdered, her death date. That is outside their flat, and so it's there. It's a permanent marker in the pavement, so that I know that they are not forgotten, and I think that's very important.
We have a couple more questions before we wind up. Somebody's asking, did you find it difficult to talk in the book about the difficult relationship you had with your father?
I think in some ways, yes, in that it was quite a troubled relationship, but I'm also a great believer in that the act of writing and clarifying your thoughts really helps. So I was angry with my father for a lot of the time when I was a sort of adult, because he was so difficult. He was, a really, really tricky man. But somehow through writing the book and ordering my thoughts in this way, I feel a lot calmer, and I have a lot more, I suppose, understanding of who he was and why he was as he was.
People need to read the book to hear you go into detail about your relationship with him. I mean, he had you followed by detectives and all sorts of things. We won't go into that here.
You talk about Jewish fathers and their relationship with their kids, but I mean, he took it to an extreme. He had been followed by private detectives, and when it was crazy. So yeah.
Also, here's our last question. I think somebody's asking how your family actually got the cafe back. I mean, they went back to Austria and took it over, but the government
restitution proceedings. So basically, after the war, the basically everything that had happened went into reverse. So the many of the senior Nazis fled and went into hiding, including Hofer, which is what another little anecdote Shelley might want to touch on. But both Hebel, who ran the cafe, and Hofer both fled to Germany. But the sort of thugs who beat up my grandfather were tried. There was a criminal trial, and they were given a couple of years in jail each. And then there were restitution proceedings, where basically the property that had been taken from the Jews, if those Jews had survived, was basically largely returned. But these were really tricky, very long-winded processes, because there was a law that said, I think it was Section 3 of the particular Restitution Act, which said basically, if the person who'd received this property had changed its nature, then they didn't have to give it back. They just had to give some money back. So there's a lot of really difficult fighting, and of course a huge amount of resentment towards the Jews who'd survived, because it was a lot easier if the Jew didn't survive, because you could hang on to the property. Yeah. So you were then in that trope of the grasping Jew who wants his property back, who wants money. So there was a lot of tension around this through those restitution proceedings, that some of them dragged on for 10, 15 years. I mean, they were positively Dickensian in their length. But my family were lucky. They got, because Hofer, who was living in our villa, had scarpered, and because Hebel, who was running the cafe, had also run into hiding, they got those back quite quickly, relatively quickly. And so that allowed my grandfather to reopen the cafe.
All right, I think we'll stop there with that lovely moment of your grandfather reopening the cafe. Thank you so much, Meriel Schindler. Meriel's book is called The Lost Café Schindler, One Family, Two Wars, and the Search for Truth. I'd also like to thank John Hobday for the warm welcome, Mark Paris for handling the technical side of things, and Roxana Browns for organizing this event. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Oh, John, we can't hear you. Oops, your mic, there we go. Is it open?
Oh, sorry. Hello. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, good. All right. Good. Thank you, Shelley, very much, and thank you, Meriel, for presenting us with such a fascinating slice of history and your family history, and a wonderful collection of photographs. We're so fortunate to have been able to share those with you. And it's a remarkable story of the Schindler family, and we hope, and I feel sure that all of us who've watched today have enjoyed this opportunity to learn from your painstaking research into the Lost Café Schindler in Innsbruck. It's been a wonderful hour or so in your company. Now, as you heard in my introduction, many people came together to help make today's presentation, special presentation, possible. The Anita and René Gabé Foundation, Marc Bissell, the Honorary Consul General of Austria, Dr. Susanna Asch-Iglesias, the German Consul General, the Goethe Institute of Montreal, and the Montreal Holocaust Museum, as well as the Jewish Book Council. And I would be remiss if I didn't also thank our indefatigable program director, Roxana Browns. And finally, I want to remind you of the next Jewish Public Library event. On Wednesday, May the 11th, at 4 p.m. Montreal time, we're presenting the book launch of The Red Sea Spies by Rafi Berg. And the author will be with us for this live presentation. We feel sure you'll want to join us, but note that it is at an unusual time. That's 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Wednesday, May the 11th. However, Roxana Browns has negotiated an arrangement for the Red Sea Spies event to be recorded. And it will be possible to watch it for 48 hours after the 4 p.m. launch on Wednesday, May the 11th. So there will be a chance, if you have difficulty in joining us at 4 p.m., there'll be plenty of opportunity later that day, and I guess through the night, to participate in the Red Sea Spies. Well, until then, on behalf of all of us at the Montreal Jewish Public Library, we wish you well and good health, and thank you again for being with us this afternoon. Thank you. Bye.